Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC Vegas 75, Marvin Vettori versus Jared Cannonier. We saw some great performances. We saw some crazy finishes, but we also saw some horrendous performances and some terrible losses. And I'm going to give my opinion on who should be cut from the UFC after their performance at UFC Vegas 75. Now, before I get into it, how I'm going to do it is I'm going to start off with an honorable mention. I only have one honorable mention for this fight card. The honorable mention means they're kind of on the fringe. Maybe they get one more opportunity in the UFC. And then I'm going to get to my list, which is in no particular order, except I'm going to say who I want cut the worst for last on this list. And that person, I want it fired before they even got home on Saturday. Now, also, comment down below, who do you believe should be cut from the UFC after their performance at UFC Vegas 75? Starting off with the first honorable mention and the only honorable mention, and that is Jimmy the Brick Flick. And I feel bad about this. I hope the UFC gives him one more opportunity. But he went out there and got absolutely decimated by Alessandro Costa. And this was a fight that I knew. I mean, Costa took on Amir Albazi on short notice and had a great performance, even though he lost. He gave a guy who's in the top 10, who now is in the top 5, he gave him everything that he could handle, and inevitably he got finished, but he took that on short notice. And I knew if Amir Albazi's having trouble taking you down, Jimmy the Brick Flick isn't going to have a lot of success with his offensive wrestling against you. And that's exactly what happened in this fight. Costa just brutally chopped the legs in the first round, had him switching stances, and once he switched stances, he had nothing to offer in the striking department. Second round, continued to chop that lead leg, had him dancing, eventually shooting on a desperation takedown, and then kind of pull guard because he knew he wasn't getting the takedown. And then he got brutally finished via ground and pound. It was nasty. Costa just absolutely wrecked him, TKO'd him in the second round. When I saw this fight was announced, I honestly thought, like, what is Flick's manager, what is his coaches thinking taking this fight? This is a horrible stylistic matchup. And then you had the fact that he lost via first round ground and pound to Charles Johnson in his last fight. So now he's on a 2-fight losing streak. He hasn't won a fight since 2020 because he came off of Dana White's Contender Series, looked impressive on Dana White's Contender Series, then came in and got a flying triangle against Cody Durden, and then he retired in the cage for essentially 3 years. He comes out of retirement and he loses to Charles Johnson, and now he loses to Alessandro Costa. And I just don't see him being successful in the flyweight division. I don't think he can move up. It's not like he's particularly big for the flyweight division. And I know these have been horrible matchups for him, and he's not, he's not crazy old. He's 32 years old, but I think he's got maybe one more shot from the UFC. They may cut him after this one. They kind of threw him to the wolves against, Alessandro Costa after his last fight. And, if you're getting ground and pound TKO by Charles Johnson, I don't think you stand a chance against Alessandro Costa. So I hope the UFC gives him one more fight and maybe gives him a little bit more manageable opponent. But it wouldn't shock me if Jimmy Flick gets cut after his performance at UFC Vegas 75 because Costa made him look like he did not even belong in there. Moving on to my actual list of who I believe should be cut after their performance. Starting off with the first on the list, Gabriel Fernandez. He took on Teresa Bleda, and she looked horrible in this fight. She couldn't stuff a takedown. She had some moments for maybe like 20, 30 seconds in the third round. But, I mean, she couldn't stuff a takedown to save her life. She had nothing to offer off of her back. She could not really get up. She had no defensive grappling. And I just think this was so low level. And, Bleda is so young. Bleda's only 21 years old. If you're getting dominated by Bleda, who's already low level herself, I don't really see a bright future for you in the division. And, just to have that level of grappling in the UFC, I think, I know the UFC has lowered the barrier of entry over the years, but I mean, it looked terrible. Gabriel Fernandez looked terrible in this fight, had no grappling at all, had nothing to offer. Stamina looked okay. Again, she did have some moments in the third round, but as soon as she started to try to get off on her feet, she got taken right back down. If you can't defend a takedown ever, you probably shouldn't be in the UFC. You probably shouldn't be competing at the highest level. So I think she's probably going to get cut. And you look at her record in the UFC, she's never won a fight in the UFC. She's had 2 fights, 2 losses. She lost to Jasmine Jadavicius, which isn't a horrible loss to have, honestly, and that was back in February of this year. But now she loses to Teresa Bleda. I think it's time for her to get cut from the organization. She had some success in LFA, and she's not particularly old. She's only 29 years old. Her striking looked good when she can get off, but you're not going to be able to strike it off, you can't defend a takedown. Everyone already knows the blueprint on you. They're going to come out, look to take you down, look to beat you up. And she's still relatively inexperienced. She only has 11 fights. She's 8-3. But when you're already fighting the bottom of the barrel and you're losing, and now you're on a 2-fight losing streak, I think most likely she gets cut from the UFC, and she deserves to be cut from the UFC. Moving up on my list, the second fighter I want cut is Zach Paunga. And Zach Paunga came off the Ultimate Fighter. A lot of people would have favored him to win against Muhammad Usman. He was winning that fight against Muhammad Usman, and then he got brutally KO'd in the second round. And then he came back and he fought Jordan Wright to a decision because he moved down to light heavyweight. And even the Jordan Wright win, even though he won clearly, it wasn't a great performance. And then last night he fought Modestas Bukauskas. And I know some people thought he won the fight. I thought he clearly lost. I thought he clearly lost rounds 1 and round 3. And, you know, he really had no success with the takedowns. I mean, I know he got him down, but he never really controlled him there. He was getting outstruck on the feet. And Modestas Bukauskas isn't the elite of the elite by any means. And Paunga, I feel bad because he's already 35 years old. I just don't think he's going to have any success. His best chance was to fight at heavyweight, and I think Muhammad Usman's one of the worst fighters at heavyweight, and heavyweight's probably the worst division in the UFC. In my opinion, men's heavyweight is the worst division in the UFC, and you're getting KO'd by Muhammad Usman, and I know he was winning the fight up until the point he got KO'd, but now you're sitting at 1-2 in the UFC. You're at 35 years old. You're losing to Modestas Bukauskas, who just re-entered the UFC because he got an opportunity on short notice. He had previously been cut, and now you can't beat him. You can't use your size. You can't use your grappling. The striking's almost non-existent. The cardio's not there. I think it's probably time for him to be cut from the UFC, and it's sad because it looked like he was going to win the Ultimate Fighter, and winning the Ultimate Fighter used to be something prestigious. It's not really anymore. Guys who win the Ultimate Fighter don't usually stick around. It used to be if you won the Ultimate Fighter because of the talent pool they had for the Ultimate Fighter. If you won the Ultimate Fighter, chances were you were going to be at least a future contender at minimum, like top 15 contender. And a lot of those guys went on to become #1 contenders and fight for titles, and some of them even win titles. But now it's kind of just lower level MMA, and you know, he didn't even win the Ultimate Fighter. He lost to Muhammad Usman. And to have a competitive fight with Jordan Wright, I think Jordan Wright was cut after that performance. He's a terrible fighter himself. And then to come out and lose to Modestas Bukauskas, you got hurt by him. You couldn't hold him down. You couldn't bully him in the clinch. And Modestas Bukauskas, bottom of the barrel at light heavyweight. I hate to say it. I like Bukauskas. I picked him to win this fight. But Zach Paunga, 35 years old. The striking really isn't there. The cardio isn't there. The wrestling is average. I think it's time the UFC cuts Zach Paunga from the UFC. Moving on to my next fighter on the list of who should be cut from the organization. And this one might be a little bit controversial, but that is Muslim Salikov. I think it's time for the UFC to cut him. He fought Nicholas Dalby last night. Honestly, you could cut Nicholas Dalby too. You know, I know he won the fight. He looked terrible in this fight too. Both guys were completely gassed in the third round, just holding on to each other for dear life, doing absolutely nothing in the third round. But, you know, Salikov was just not there. I mean, he had some moments in the first round, and I think he got rocked at the end of the first round, so he lost the first round. And then after that, he was just not there. He was throwing some spinning techniques, not really landing, not really having success with the striking, not able to get Dalby off of him when he clinched up with him and pushed him against the fence. And if you're getting bullied by Nicholas Dalby, you probably shouldn't be in the UFC. Nicholas Dalby, barely in the UFC. And now Muslim Salikov is, you know, he's getting up there in age. He's almost 40 years old. That is crazy to me. He's 40 years old. And I just don't think that performance against Nicholas Dalby should keep him around in the UFC. I think it's time. You know, he's lost 2 out of his last 3. He has a win over Andre Fialho, which is a good win. He KO'd him with a spinning back fist, and that was in round 3. And honestly, I thought Salikov was going to have the better cardio in this fight. But he got KO'd by Li Jingliang, which isn't a bad loss to have. He loses to Nicholas Dalby in this fight. In between there, he has the win over Fialho. I just think, I mean, what's he going to do in the division anymore? What is he going to do? Can someone tell me what he's going to do? Because I don't see a path forward for him at 170 pounds. He's not going to be top 15. He shouldn't be top 20. He's slow and he has no cardio and he can't defend the grappling. And it's like after the first round, he just doesn't have anything left in the gas tank if he throws any output. It's not like he's having a crazy output. He gets rocked. The defensive striking isn't there. And I just think it's time for Muslim Salikov to go somewhere else, maybe go to another organization and try to get some wins there. I don't even know if he's going to win in other organizations. And I don't know if other organizations would even pick him up, you know? So Maybe it's time for him to call it a career. I just don't know. He looked terrible against Nicholas Dalby. Couldn't get off of him. Couldn't get Dalby off of him against the cage. And Dalby was just holding on. And then the times that Salikov had the opportunities to disengage, he just stayed there and then got reversed again. And then just stayed there. And he knew he was losing. He had no will to win. He had no cardio. The striking looked terrible after round one. And I think it's time for the UFC to part ways with Muslim Salikov. Now, before I get to my last on the list, who do I actually believe will be cut from the organization? I believe Jimmy Flick will probably be cut, even though he's an honorable mention. I hope they give him one more opportunity. I believe Gabriel Fernandez will be cut. I believe Zach Paunga will be cut from the organization. Muslim Salikov, I say 50-50. I say 50-50, and I still hope they give Jimmy Flick another opportunity. So maybe that's like 75% chance he gets cut, in my opinion. But I think most of these guys actually will get cut from the organization after their performances at UFC Vegas 75. Now, getting on to the last on the list, who I believe there's no chance in hell that they are cut from the UFC, because technically the UFC does not have a contract with them. And this is actually two people from UFC Vegas 75. And that is Keith Peterson needs to be cut, needs to be fired from the Athletic Commission. And we also have Jaron Villel, who is another referee for the Athletic Commission in Las Vegas. Both these guys need to be fired immediately by the Athletic Commissions and need to be put in prison. They're going to get somebody killed. And if I'm the UFC, I know it's a conflict of interest to try to lobby on who should be reffing fights, but I wouldn't want these guys anywhere near my organization. They're going to kill the sport. Because you look at some of these stoppages. I mean, the first stoppage by Keith Peterson of the night, Ronnie Lawrence versus Daniel Argueta. This wasn't a late stoppage. This was an early stoppage. Daniel Argueta had a mounted guillotine that Ronnie Lawrence had his hand extended. Keith Peterson grabs his wrist. He pulls his wrist back. Keith Peterson says he taps. Now, I will credit Keith Peterson. Keith Peterson looked at the replay and determined he did not tap and made it a no contest. So once you make the mistake, the only thing you can do is attempt to rectify it. And even though it ruins the fight and it ruins somebody getting their win bonus, at least he rectified it, because so many refs and so many athletic commissions, once they make a mistake, they double down on it, they bury their heads in the sand, and then they're just unwilling to do anything about it, even on appeal. So I will credit him for at least fixing that. But then I want to skip ahead to the co-main event, which is Arman Tsarukyan versus Joaquim Silva. This was one of the worst stoppages I've ever seen. This is Keith Peterson. We're going to get to Jaron Villel in a second. This is, again, Keith Peterson. This was a crazy fight. This was a fun fight. If you want to check out my full card post-fight, I'll link it down in the description. But in that third round, they're up in the clinch, and Silva throws a high knee, and Tsarukyan ducks underneath of it, puts his hand behind the kneecap of Silva, and slams him to the ground. The second he slams him to the ground, Silva was essentially flash KO'd. He woke back up. He tried to scramble a little bit. This went on for like a minute and a half. And Tsarukyan was just beating the crap out of him. Nasty ground and pound, over and over and over again. Hard punches, hard elbows, just beating him up. And I'm watching. I'm like, okay, Keith, come on, let's get in there, Keith. Any second now, Keith. And then as Tsarukyan's beating the crap out of him, finally Tsarukyan's like, okay, I'm going to mount him now. He mounts him, postures up with no defense from Silva at all, starts raining down nasty hammer fist over and over and over again. And even once he gets into the full mount, Keith Peterson's just sitting there thinking about a pack of Marlboro Reds. And instead of stopping the fight, it took 15 seconds roughly after Tsarukyan got into the full mount to stop the fight. This was one of the worst stoppages I've ever seen. We're going to talk about the worst one on this card in a minute. This is unacceptable. This is indefensible. This is going to get somebody killed. This is going to ruin the sport. If someone dies in the UFC, that's going to be a massive deal, and that will hurt the sport like you cannot even believe. Believe me, this would happen if someone dies. And the way someone's going to die, of course it could happen with a freak. But in this case, this was totally avoidable. This is not a freak accident. This is not one-punch knockout where someone just happens to die. This is where someone is taking sustained damage over the course of a minute and a half, where the referee should get in there and stop the fight. I honestly believe they need to do something to fix this. They need to have a second referee. Here's my opinion on this. I might eventually make a video on this whole reffing situation because I actually believe reffing is worse than judging. Nobody will say that. I'll be the first to say it. Reffing is worse than judging. I think we need a ref in the back watching on monitors, and the ref that's in the cage, have him in his earpiece. And I think that ref needs to start feeding some information like, hey, I think it's time to stop it. You know, the ref in the cage is going to ultimately have the decision, but at least you have that second set of eyes helping them, guide them through the earpiece, and it's another ref who's hired from the Athletic Commission. I thought this was a horrible stoppage. I think Keith Peterson needs to be held accountable by the commission for this level of stoppage because he's going to get somebody killed. Now, moving on to Jared Cannonier. This guy, if I see him out in public, I'm going to Boston crab him. This guy's an embarrassment to the sport, and I think this guy teaches people how to become referees. This was one of the worst stoppages I've ever seen, combined with potentially a bad decision on top of it. You had Carlos Hernandez versus Dennis Bondar, and this fight was competitive, but Hernandez was clearly winning. The last 10 seconds of the third round, Hernandez has a slam in the clinch, slams Bondar on his head. Bondar's out immediately. Then, instead of Jared Cannonier stepping in because the guy's unconscious, he looks like a dead body there, Hernandez is just allowed to rain down seven, I counted them, hard, brutal ground and pound elbows where Bondar's head is flat against the mat. And he's just slamming elbows over and over and over again. And Jared Cannonier is just standing there doing absolutely nothing. And then he finally steps in. This was right up there with the CB Dalloway Herb Dean stoppage from years ago. I forgot the other guy's name. It was some Russian guy who fought CB Dalloway. If you haven't seen that Herb Dean stoppage, I think that is the worst stoppage I've ever seen because he didn't actually even stop it. CB Dalloway was curled up in a position, taking shots for a minute and a half until the round ended. He never even moved. The guy was punching a dead body. And I don't want to get into Herb Dean, but you get my point. This is right up there with that stoppage. Go look that stoppage up. And then he has the audacity to say, well, I think the knockout was a result of a headbutt because as Hernandez took him down, they clashed heads. And I think this was the best decision Jared Cannonier ever made because of that decision, and it ended up being a technical decision rather than a knockout because they said the knockout was attributed to the head clash. Everyone was focused on the decision to change it from a knockout to a technical decision versus the actual stoppage itself. So now Cannonier shifted the heat. Rather than being criticized for a horribly late stoppage, he's being criticized for making it a technical decision. Now, in my opinion, I didn't care that they changed it from a KO to TKO or TKO-KO to a technical decision because they did clash heads as he took him down. Now, would I have made that decision? No. Did I necessarily agree with it? No. But I don't care about it because what my main focus is this horrendous stoppage. Why are we allowing this? And in the co-main event, I forgot to mention, even with Keith Peterson and Arman Tsarukyan and Joaquim Silva, you had Dominic Cruz praising it on air. This drives me nuts because this is somebody's life here. You know, we watch this sport and we see these guys take a lot of damage. Once the fight is over, the fight is over. There's no need for a guy who's essentially a dead body eating ridiculous amounts of ground and pound. I mean, Keith Peterson and Jared Cannonier were the equivalent of that meme where it's like a stick figure poking something with a stick and it's like, move, move. They were helpless in there. They need to have their reffing license revoked. They are horrible. They're going to get someone killed. And this is just one card. This is just one card. I'm about to start compiling all the referee mistakes that I see throughout the year because I'm tired of seeing this. And I believe reffing is worse than judging. It's that bad. It's going to get someone killed. And I think that Jared Cannonier and Keith Peterson need to be fired immediately or bare minimum demoted. They should not be. I mean, I don't want to ref in anyone's fight. If I had a friend and Keith Peterson's your ref, I'm like, no way. No, pull out of the fight. Request a different ref. I wouldn't want Keith Peterson as my ref. He's either going to stop it early. I guess because he stopped it earlier in the night. He stopped the Ronnie Lawrence fight early. I guess he said, let's have a death match in the co-main event. That seems what Keith Peterson was doing. He's too busy thinking about the Marlboro Reds and probably has some Bud Light hanging out in his truck. He needs a smoke break. It's the third round. He's like, you know what? I'm too focused on that, living in a different world. And then he comes back and he's like, oh, Tsarukyan's really beating him up here. Let me actually do my job and stop the fight. I want these guys fired. I want these guys fired. I want criticism on them. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's criticizing these guys. I want them gone from the sport. They are going to ruin the sport. And that's why, forget about all the fighters in this video. Keith Peterson, Jaron Villel need to be gone immediately. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.